Mr. Wilkinson, a very good morning to you.
Good morning. How are you?
I'm doing really well. Thank you for taking the time to speak to us.
Absolutely. Always pleased to be on the show.
Likewise. Thank you. Good to have you. So, Mr. Wilkinson, the first question I want to ask you is about the moratorium that has been put on eviction of residential tenants by the BC government. A lot of landlords are now asking that with the restrictions as they are being eased, now maybe is the time to lift that moratorium so that landlords can start evicting tenants if and when there is a need. What's your take on that? Do you think now is the time to lift that moratorium?
Well, we all heard the news this morning, I think, that apparently 10% of tenants aren't paying any rent at all. Mm-hmm. And we've probably come across those stories of people returning from where they had gone away and coming back to the place they were supposed to move back into and finding the tenants refusing to leave. So this is a problem that is going to develop in the next few months. And clearly the government's going to have to come up with an answer about this because it's John Horgan put on the moratorium on evictions in late March, and now has now been April, May, and June where rent may or may not have been paid. Obviously, you hope that the landlord and the tenant can sort things out, and there are the rent subsidies for tenants when they need them. But we're going to have to sort out what the plan is for those 10% of people. And this comes to the bigger question, as you were talking about in the introduction. New Zealand has gone back to normal now. Mm-hmm. There are no known cases in New Zealand. Things are all the restrictions are gone except about international travel, people coming in by air. So in British Columbia, the northern two-thirds of the province has no cases. Everywhere east of Hope has no cases, and Vancouver Island has no cases. So, for example, these rent rules, should those remain in place when there are 0 cases of the virus? They're only in Vancouver metro area and in the Lower Fraser Valley. Mm-hmm. So all the other 95% of the area of the province is still on the same rules as the area where there are some cases still in metro Vancouver. So how do we move ahead? When we get to 0, what happens? That's the question we're asking.
Mm-hmm. And that's where I think your suggestion was last week about a regional reopening plan rather than a province-wide reopening plan. The idea carries a lot of logic in it, but the government has said that province-wide restrictions would still remain in place. What's your take on that?
Well, I think it's a question of the interior, the North and Vancouver Island saying, well, how long do we have to be at 0 before we can get back to normal? Mm-hmm. Are we always going to be controlled by the activity in the Lower Mainland? If the Lower Mainland, as it hopefully will, goes down to below 100 known cases and nobody in hospital, and then below 50 cases, and then below 10, does all of the rest of the province still wait for the Lower Mainland to get to 0? And when we get to 0, are we going to be like New Zealand? Probably not, because we've got the U.S. border and the Alberta border to deal with. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, what are the criteria? How are these decisions made? People legitimately are asking the question that we get all over BC. So what are the circumstances for normalizing? What are the criteria? And we've had daily reports of case counts, so we all follow that. And the case counts are fortunately becoming quite small, which is a success for Dr. Henry and the province. But when they get to be very, very, very small and down to 0, then what happens? We know what's happened in New Zealand. They've just said, okay, back to normal except for international air travel, and we'll hopefully get things going again. If you're in Kamloops or Kelowna or Prince George, you have the same question.
Mm-hmm. The other issue that is now going parallel, especially for the last 2 weeks, is the protests with surrounding Black Lives Matter and Indigenous Lives Matter, especially on the Canadian side. And the protests that are taking place in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic, there have been some concerns about the spread of the virus again, reinvigorating itself with the protests and the people gathering at the protests. Do you think there should have been a different approach from the side of the authorities with an appeal to the protesters to maybe do all of this virtually, as we've done all the other gatherings in the last few weeks?
Yeah, this is another legitimate question. And one of my family members went to the Vancouver demonstration, and they were all asked by the organizers to keep 2 meters apart so that they could all swing their arms and not touch anybody. Mm-hmm. And that's a responsible approach. Now, there is the democratic right to protest, but we have to balance that now with the desire to get rid of this virus so we can all get back to normal. And that's a real balancing act for the authorities in British Columbia. It seems to have gone okay here, but we've got to encourage people to spread themselves out and preferably not gather in groups of more than 50, 'cause that's what Bonnie Henry said. And the original rationale was, well, if you go to a wedding, then everybody's close together, a high school graduation, and they're going to mingle because they go on for a while, whereas protests are short and people don't know each other. Well, the protest in Vancouver went on for about 6 hours. So this is an issue that we're going to have to hear from Bonnie Henry about what her plan is in that regard. And it also, of course, raises the issue of the treatment of racism in Canada. I think it's obvious to your listeners that it exists. It has not gone away. And so what more can we do, both at the individual level, in terms of the groupings we work in, whether that's the associations and clubs and organizations we have informally, or more formal things like companies and businesses, or at the government level. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done on this. And the consciousness has been raised dramatically in the United States. And clearly, there's a whole batch of people, large numbers of people in Vancouver and Victoria who are very concerned about this, and rightly so.
Mr. Wilkinson, there is this argument floating around now about defunding the police and body cams for police officers. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau commented about this earlier this morning, saying that he'll be working with the provincial premiers to bring in body cameras for police officers. What's your take on that? Do you think police officers should mandatorily have body cameras on their person?
It's a topic that is long overdue for discussion because this technology has been around for about 10 years now. We all know about those little GoPro cameras that people use when they go skiing and things. And so those are small, effective video recording devices, and the police seem to have a version of it that clips onto the chest. Doesn't weigh very much. And so the question arises, they have them in police cars, as we've all seen, mounted on the dashboard, and should they be on the officer themselves? There will be issues around that in both directions. We need to put those issues out in public and have a discussion about them.
But what's your take on that? Do you think it would be a good idea?
It, on the face of it, sounds like a good idea, but you'd want to hear from all sides if there are problems and issues, and we haven't thought it through completely. Otherwise, it would have happened already 10 years ago. So let's get the issues on the table and have a discussion in public about it.
Mr. Wilkinson, as now activity resumes and more people are getting out, what's the one message you would like to give people? What's the one thing you would like to see happen to ease the transition back into normalcy?
We want to defeat this virus, folks. We want to have a zero case count in British Columbia. So unfortunately, for the time being, that means we have to have a bunch of restrictions, especially in the Lower Mainland. But we, all throughout British Columbia, there is no reason that people shouldn't maintain the social distancing. There's no room for shaking hands or hugs, unfortunately. There's no room for going and visiting long-term care facilities unless you have a good reason and have the permission of the people there. Because we want to defeat this virus completely. And then we'll be able to talk more openly about the opportunity to get things back to normal. And as we say, it's a very valid question through the Interior. What happens when you get to zero? We should all be starting to think about that.
Mr. Wilkinson, thank you for your time this morning. Pleasure talking to you.
Bye-bye. All the best. Bye-bye.